We're here in this half hour to talk about the Trump war on diversity. And before we get to our guest, Edwith Theogene, we're going to listen to this clip from Sonny Hostin on The View about diversity.
When we're talking about DEI, we're not talking about a DEI. When we're talking about DEI, we're not talking about a DEI office. We're talking about equal opportunity and inclusion across all offices for all people so that it is more reflective of what America looks like. This will specifically harm women, right? And it will specifically harm African Americans and Latinos. So we're not just talking about black jobs.
How about Asians?
It will affect Asians as well. And so I think this is really counter to his campaign promises to protect black jobs, because in the federal government, overwhelmingly, black professionals work there. We're talking about over 16%, more than the black population. And so I think what we're facing here is sort of a second nadir, because Woodrow Wilson, back in the day, did the same thing. He resegregated the federal government, leading to a plunge in income for not only black workers, but also for women. And so what we're seeing is an attack, not on necessarily DEI or wokeness. We're seeing an attack on the very fabric of our company, which is opportunity for all, including women. And women, what Whoopi has said often, women were really the most, they gained the most advantages from affirmative action. And so this is a war on women. I think it's a war on people of color. And what we're going to see is a lot of pain, but especially to those communities that need those jobs.
You talking about the Trump administration's war against diversity. Our guest in this half hour is Edwith Theogene, who is a policy and advocacy strategist. Edwith, let me start off with this. I've seen in the last week, especially Republicans on TV or whatever, talking about DEI like it's some kind of epithet or slur. Can you explain to our viewers and listeners what DEI stands for and means?
Sure. I think you're totally right on the head about there's a false definition out there of what diversity, equity, and inclusion means. And I also want to throw in there accessibility, because all of these rollbacks will also impact folks who are part of that community. So diversity just means many different kinds. There's diversity, like diversity of thought, like it's not homogeneous. And then you also have inclusion, which means that it's an inclusive sort of dynamic where everyone feels like they belong and they have access. And then equity takes into consideration how people are showing up into a place, and are they showing up in an equitable manner. So that is how I define diversity, equity, and inclusion. And then accessibility, meaning that everyone has the ability to access either resources and opportunities in the same way, regardless of how, like, their accessibility challenges.
Okay. Now, how do we get to the point, and I don't think this is, too much of a comparison, where basically, people I see on TV are just saying DEI like it's a swear word. How do we get to that point?
I mean, I think our side, the progressive side, Democrats, we always allow Republicans and conservatives to define the playing field. And whatever they deem as a bad word, it almost is like that is what exists. But let's not get caught up in semantics. I don't care what you call it, diversity, equity, inclusion. We have to look at the principle and the core idea behind it. And especially in this sort of dynamic, what we are looking at is we want our government to provide resources and opportunities to all Americans, to all people, regardless of race, sexual orientation, gender, accessibility factors, color. Like, it doesn't matter. Our government should work for all people. So whether you want to call it DEI or you want to call it everyone come one, come all, like, it doesn't matter. We need to focus on the core principles. And I think that the right, conservatives, they're basically using words and demonizing words as a form of distraction to get us into this back and forth of like, that's not what it means. This is what it means. I mean, if you look at Trump's executive order and Biden's executive orders, they clearly define DEI as two different things, right? So obviously, there's some sort of difference in those definitions. But what we really need to get at is, why do we need DEI? What are the exact issues that need to be solved? Like, that is the core of it. And I just think like this whole back and forth on words and language, while I do think language is important in this particular setting, it just seems like a distraction.
Okay. Well, let's try to answer that question you raised. Uh, what, in the first week of his presidency, Donald Trump has taken, a really destructive attitude towards diversity,
Mm-hmm.
in all sorts of ways and all sorts of executive orders. What what is the impact? What will be the impact of Trump's actions?
I mean, I think the impacts are far reaching and it's still yet to be seen, but basically he wants to roll back all of the progress that we made under the Biden administration with the two executive orders that he made. It was a historic moment when Biden, first day in office, introduced an executive order on racial equity, and sort of propelling our government to operate differently, to be an inclusive democracy and to function in that way. And with Trump in office, his first thing was to undo all of that. And it's problematic because under the executive orders by Biden, we saw that there was lower unemployment rates for Black people, for Latino communities. We also saw that the government was sort of being more deliberate and responsible as it related to like taxpayer resources and government resources. It really implemented structure and data informed research in a way that created a positive change for how our government operates. With these rollbacks of these programs by Trump in this executive order, I imagine we're going to have huge economic impacts. We all know that DEI equals huge economic gains. Without DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, I imagine there will be a rollback. I also think that the federal government, as Sunny said, is one of the largest employers of people of color. It was one of the acts that happened right after the Civil Rights Act. They desegregated our federal government. It provided so much opportunities for people of color. It also strongly impacted the racial wealth gap as well. And I imagine that with these rollbacks, we're going to see a decline in some of that progress.
Well, let me ask you this question. How is this going to, Trump is doing these things because I'm sure he feels it's going to strengthen his political position. I'd like to think not. But how far is America going to tolerate these actions in its fight against diversity?
I hope not. I mean, we saw in 2020, after sort of a huge racial justice reckoning after the murder of George Floyd and many, you know, awful, tragic murders and of people of color, particularly of Black men. And a lot of businesses and people sort of took this big moment of reflection to reorient how they were using their funds, how they were delivering either their programmatic work. And so many companies came out with commitments. And now, because of how Trump is moving and the things that he's doing, we're seeing a lot of people take those initiatives off the table. A great example is Target, who wants to take back a lot of their programming around diversity, inclusion, and equity. So that's a huge problem. But we all know that diversity, equity, inclusion, like I said, has great economic gains. It has great, it provides us with a lot of innovative strategies and solutions and dynamics that we need in order to, prosper as a country. So I do think that people support DEI efforts and they want those things to continue. But right now, just given the political climate that they are targeting this as an enemy, and given how they have created vulnerabilities for businesses, they're scared to take these risks and to maintain their promises that they held up. We all know that like people voting with their money, we saw huge inclines of people's bottom lines when companies put these commitments to racial equity and justice, So I think that that's something to consider.
Okay, we're going to have to take a break now so we can give our radio listeners a little vacation. We'll be back with more of Deadline DC with Brad Bannon and our guest, policy and advocacy strategist Edwith Theogene, and we'll talk more about this very vital issue when we get back from our break. So don't go anywhere. I also want to thank our executive producer, Mark Grimaldi, who's keeping us online and going offline. But we'll be back right after these messages. Welcome back to Deadline DC with Brad Bannon. My guest in this half hour of Deadline DC is Edwith Theogene, a policy and advocacy strategist. Let me ask you this question, Edwith. As a policy and advocacy strategist, what should we be doing to advocate our position, the progressive position on this issue?
Yeah, I mean, there's two great things that have been happening in terms of the response from Congress. So Maxine Waters, who is the head of the Financial Services Committee in the House, has sent out a letter to the Biden administration outlining a bunch of core issues and challenges with these Trump executive orders. First of all, the executive orders, there's a legality concern that exists. There's also an implementation concern that exists, like how can we really implement this? And also it violates different congressional rules that already exist. So I think reaching out to Maxine Waters' office and cheering them on is something to show that we care about these issues and these are things that we get behind. Also, Ayanna Pressley and Cory Booker, they previously have introduced a bill that sort of institutionalizes Biden's executive orders around racial equity and justice and the government prioritizing social impact assessments and using data and research to really understand how the government is providing its services and to ensure that the government services reach everyone. So I think showing your support and asking your representative or member of Congress to get behind these bills is really important. We really want to make sure that we can have this sort of response to the Biden administration. The administration is going to do what the administration is going to do, but just because they do those things does not mean that it's legal, that it makes sense, or that it's right. So Congress is definitely taking action. We do have some strong leadership, like I said, with Maxine Waters, with Cory Booker, and with Ayanna Pressley. So make sure that your member and your representative is on those bills. And at a state and local level, there are also DEI programs that are within your state. And I think we should all research like what those are in our state. If they don't exist, basically reach out to your state legislative or representative or governor and let them know that we want these things to exist. We want DEI to be part of how our government operates. And if they do exist within your community, we want to make sure that they're shored up, that they have the proper funding, they have the proper resources, that they can have the impact that they should have. So there's a lot of different things that you can do at every level of government, even on the city and local level. You can ask your city government to pass diversity, equity, and inclusion resolutions. You can ask them to also make sure that they incorporate social impact assessments at the city level as well. So there are a lot of opportunities to push back, and I know that this was only some of the executive orders that Trump signed his first day in office. There are tons of them that he signed, but and that can be exhausting. But we've all seen, yeah. But we've all seen that there's still things that you can do. Like government has not stopped, so.
Okay, Edwith, we're going to have to take a break here to bring back our noble listeners on radio. We'll be back with more of Deadline DC with Brad Bannon and our guest, Edwith Theogene, when we get back from this very short break. Welcome back to Deadline DC with Brad Bannon. And by the way, a note to our radio listeners that if you want to watch Deadline DC as well as listen to it, you can watch it at twitter.com/Brad Bannon, at facebook.com Deadline DC with Brad Bannon /videos, or on YouTube at youtube.com/DeadlineDC. Our guest in this half hour is policy and advocacy strategist Edwith Theogene. We've been talking about some of the drastic actions that the president has taken in the first week of his presidency. Let me go back and ask you about something you mentioned in the first segment. As you said, some companies, and you mentioned Target as an example, but there have been others like Meta has eliminated its diversity program. Other companies, I believe Costco has resolutely kept theirs. What kind of impact do you think this will have in the private sector?
I think it's going to have a huge impact because you're basically limiting your talent pool. You're not giving everyone a fair shot or opportunity or providing them the resources and opportunity. I also think that it's a bad decision for businesses to make to pull back these diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts because we all know that when a company states this kind of commitment, people support it. They spend their dollars. When you say, like at Target, they had a whole Black business ownership like section. They had businesses that they literally promoted. They also had a Black History Month where they would bring out all these different t-shirts and cool swag. And trust me, I bought it. But now understanding where Target sits and essentially the message that it sends to me as a Black person to buy products and do all these things, it's like, you don't care about me. You don't care about the opportunities that I have. So I'm going to go spend my money elsewhere. And I think a lot of people are looking at it in that same way. Research has shown that when a company has an inclusive business model, whether it's to their employees or even to the products that they're selling, it is good for them. It lifts up their, it has great economic gains for them and financial gains for them. So in taking that away, I'm sure that that's going to be a bad choice and decision, and it's going to basically roll back their dollars.
We can only hope so. Let me ask you this question. In the short term, what can you say to our progressive audience that's encouraging? I mean, for a lot of people, progressives, I guess a lot of people who watch or listen to the show, this last week has been a nightmare,
Yeah.
and I don't think this nightmare is going to end anytime soon. So, can you offer any encouragement to the people who watch and listen to the show?
Yeah. I mean, everyone has their own bandwidth. And I think we all need to make sure that we're taking care of ourselves. I feel like there's an onslaught of feelings and information and all these things that are happening. So I think practicing self-care, and what I mean by that is like listening to yourself. Am I okay to actually like read this news article? Am I okay to watch this conversation of people going back and forth on with Trump? Is this going to trigger me? Is this going to is this for my benefit and good? So I do encourage people to do that. Also, I encourage you, like, you are not powerless. I know you might feel like you don't have any power, but you are not.
Yeah, I think a lot of our people feel that way.
Yeah, I think the more you know and the more information you have, the more you'll get a sense of like how much power you do have. So when you invited me to come on this show, I obviously started doing my research, and I was happy to see that Representative Ayanna Pressley, that Congresswoman Maxine Waters, that Congress is not lying down, that there's still leadership out there, and they need us to support them to do the thing that we need them to do, right? And if they're not doing the thing that we need them to do, we need to put pressure on them so they can do that. Using your voice in whatever way that you can, whether it's telling people that you don't support this, whether it's writing your member of Congress or just having a conversation. I think we need to start talking and engaging with each other about these issues. But before you do that, make sure that you're in a good place to take that on.
Okay, let me ask you this question. You mentioned three members of Congress. Presley, who was actually my daughter's representative in the United States House, uh, Senator Booker. Uh, are there any white members of Congress who are making this a big deal?
I cannot name off the top of my head, but I'm sure that there is. I mean, in order for any of these efforts to work, it's going to take everyone. It benefits everyone, like diversity, equity, and inclusion benefits all of us. Like, for instance, research shows that closing opportunity gaps could add $5 trillion to the GDP. It benefits all of us. It's not just for some of us. So forget what Trump and what everyone else is saying, that this is something that only benefits a few. So since it benefits all of us, we all need everyone to make it happen. So I can't think of any off the top of my head, but there's always been these stalwart um, leaders within Congress who are of every color, right, on our side. So I can imagine that they are. I think it's more so less about the race and more about where you are in the party line. Like, I'm from Florida. I currently vote right now in Washington, D.C., but it's very hard for Floridians, on a lot of different levels. But there's still leaders and people who are using their voice and standing up. So it's up to us to actually do that research and figure out who those people are.
Okay, let's try this. In the 2024 presidential election, the number of black male black voters who supported Trump, there was a big increase in male black support for Trump. I mean, Harris won the majority, but there was, big increase in male black support for Trump. There was a massive increase in male Latino support for Trump. In fact, he won a majority of the Latino male vote. To what extent is this going to hurt Republicans, facing the midterm elections in 2026, in terms of, preserving their support that they gained among people of color in elections?
I mean, it's going to be interesting because I think a lot of people said that their motivations for voting for Trump was because they'd have more job opportunities and their groceries would be cheaper. And what we're seeing is, by removing the diversity, equity, and inclusion programmatic programs and laying off a bunch of the folks who focus on that, we're already seeing that they're not going to have as many jobs as they thought that they were going to have. We'll have to see it on a bigger scale in terms of like how our economy performs and what job opportunities look like for businesses. But if businesses are rolling back their programs and the government is rolling back their programs, there's going to be less jobs. So I don't think that they're going to be able to preserve a lot of those gains that they've made. And when it comes to the cost of groceries, we're also going to see what that looks like now. I mean, when you think about inflation, a lot of the inflation that we're experiencing now existed because of Trump's previous tax codes that he implemented, right? There were a lot of different things that happened, like allowing big business to do whatever they want, to put whatever price on that they want. So we're going to need to see some action in order for us to feel that financial gain and to lower the cost of our groceries or our day-to-day things that we have to pay for. The Trump administration is going to have to do a lot. I don't think that this administration is actually going to do those things, but that's what people said was their motivation. So we'll have to see.
Okay, well, we'll see soon. Let me ask you one last question, because we're almost at the end of our time. And what is the best argument for supporters of diversity to make? I mean, we have limited means of reaching communications outlets. What's our best short message for supporting diversity?
I think, one, we need to look at the economic and operational benefits across the board, whether it's government or business. It is good for business. It is good for the bottom line. It is good for our government. And then also, I think we need to address the misconceptions about diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. These programs focus on removing barriers. They don't focus on preferences. They help ensure that qualified people aren't overlooked. They're not trying to lower their standards so that anyone can come in. And they also improve accessibility for disabled Americans, for disabled people. So again, that accessibility piece is also very
Okay, we're going
important.
to have to stop it there. Next time we have you on, I'll give you more time to answer that very important question. I want to thank our guest for joining us on Deadline DC today. In the first half hour, we had Tara Devlin, the host of the Terror Buster podcast. In this half hour, Edwith Theogene, who's a policy and advocate strategist, joined us. I also want to thank our executive producer, Mark Grimaldi, for making sure this show runs on time and stays online. We'll be back with more of the resistance against Trump and the best and aggressive progressive talk next Monday at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. Make sure you're there, or be square.